وي كتير.
Yes, كتير.
Yes كتير منيح.
All right. Okay, so good. We are now recording. Okay. So هحكي بالإنجليزي. I'm going to talk in English as usual for our our friends who don't speak Arabic. So what are we talking about today? What we are talking about is, above all else, is ritualization. What do we mean by rituals? Well, strangely enough, artistic practices can be considered emerged originally from ritualistic activities. And we know this from the Paleolithic. Yeah? We know, and you remember, all of you, that the caves in the Paleolithic were ritualistic spaces, indicating something fundamental in humanity, our ability to separate what we call the sacred from the profane. In the old world, a sacred and a less sacred world, because this separation was not as clear-cut as it is today. So what is it that we are seeing here? What we are seeing here is forms of ritualization which we will try to understand. And we will try to understand, our basic hypothesis is the following, is that a painting can be the focus of a ritualistic activity related to its economic, socio-political context. And in that sense, its narrative plays a role in the determination of society, in the way society functions. And that object that we are going to study is this one. We've talked about it, Eugène Delacroix, the Dust of Sardanapalus. And we describe its context. Basic context is that of a historical crisis, an enormous historical crisis that lasted in France for 100 years. In France, for 100 years, you had about one great revolution every 20-25 years. So that's actually worse than us. Oh, well, not really, but yeah, okay. No, actually worse, sorry. And this crisis can be described as, how would Shakespeare describe it? As a crisis of degree. He has this beautiful image when people are fighting each other for a degree, meaning to go up the hierarchy. Each one of them is pulling the other down, and at the end, they are all at the same level. Well, this is what we see in France. What we see is a grave crisis in degree, grave crisis in social hierarchy. Why? Well, there was a mythology that was in fact stabilizing French society, up to a point, of course. That stability was always in question, but the crisis we see after the French Revolution is something else completely. Now, what was that mythology? Well, it was a mythology. It was the linking. It was the linking of French royalty to religion. A description of the cosmos. By that we mean not just the cosmos in our modern sense, but the physical, the political, the religious, the political, the economical. That was the cosmos. In ancient society, the cosmos included the inter-individual interactions of human beings. The cosmos was seen as a reflection of and understood in reverse, but as a reflection, the cosmos was seen as a reflection of human society, but understood of human society being a reflection of the cosmos. Yeah? What does that mean? What it means is that after that annoying man Kepler, Nikolai Kepler, started dismantling this cosmological view that justified the political order, we start seeing a more or less rapid dismantling of European society. That dismantling of European society, we think of it, when we think of this dismantling of European society, we think of something like, I don't know, let's say, 1517, the hanging on the church's doors of the 95 Theses of Martin Luther. Yes, but that's only one manifestation. Another manifestation is something like the infinitesimal in mathematics. You see in the 17th and the 18th century a ferocious battle in the world of mathematics against something called the infinitesimal. Why? Well, because mathematics, Euclidean mathematics more precisely, were seen as a representation of truth. And the nature of Euclidean mathematics is to be hierarchical. Very well ordered. You start with the axioms, and then from demonstration to demonstration, you reach higher and higher levels of complexity. Okay, but what did the infinitesimal do? Well, it introduced an element of paradoxical, an element of arbitrary to it. It can be described as arbitrary. But the damn thing worked. It worked spectacularly well as a description of the universe, as understood by people, well, more or less by Galileo, but done even more spectacularly by somebody like Newton. Well, what does this mean? Well, what it means is that the model of the universe as reflecting or being reflected in the hierarchical order of society was no longer tenable, intellectually tenable. And this is why you see, for instance, the Jesuits ferociously fighting against ideas such as the infinitesimal. We think that Galileo was fought because tried by the Inquisition because of his heliocentric view of the universe, the idea that the Earth turns around the sun. But that's not all. His more dangerous idea, much more dangerous idea, was the idea of the infinitesimal. In Italy, the idea of the infinitesimal was successfully repressed. Well, what happened when it was successfully repressed? It went into Germany and it went into England. And so, whereas in the 17th century, the Italians were at the top of the hierarchical, at the avant-garde of the scientific discoveries, after the successful repression of the infinitesimal in Italy, the scientific revolution moves to England, moves to Germany. Well, what did the scientific revolution do? Well, what it did, in fact, was establish through observation, through theory, through internal coherence and external relationship of this coherence to external reality. The internal coherence given by mathematics, relation given by observation. But what did they do? What they did was, in fact, establish that the universe is not as it was described by this mythology. Yeah? So that the mythology would justify the places of the roles of kings such as Louis XIV and Louis XV. By the time of Louis XVI, and by the time of the American Revolution against the French king, sorry, the English king, George. By the time of that, this mythology was no longer tenable. The elites, the intellectual elites, I'm talking about the peasants. The peasants, I don't know. They might have absolute geniuses. 95% of us are originally peasants. But the elites who came from the city, the bourgeoisie, who had enough time and enough money to educate themselves, did not believe in it anymore. And these were the people who agitated for a change in the system. That agitation in the change of this in the system was, in fact, a crisis of degree, as Shakespeare would say. Shakespeare was, by the way, very authoritarian. It was, in effect, a crisis in hierarchy, leading, of course, to the French Revolution, the beheading, the terror, the imperial period of Napoleon, and the collapse of the imperial period in the Battle of Waterloo, followed by the restoration of the kingdom of Louis XVIII. But Louis XVIII was not Louis XIV. Louis XVIII understood, he was a smart man, who had suffered in his life. He understood the limitations of his power. Something that Charles X, his successor, did not understand. So he attempted to repress freedom of speech, of press, which Louis XVIII had, up to some degree, allowed. He attempted to impose laws that the liberals, this amalgamation of the fragments of the Bonapartists, of the bourgeoisie, high bourgeoisie, and those who wanted to establish a monarchy close to that found in England and in Great Britain, who wanted to limit the power of the French government. He attempted to reimpose absolute royalty as it was practiced during the so-called golden period. It's not so golden, but anyway, the period of Louis XIV. What did that lead to? Well, what it led to was an internal crisis. The King Charles understood that he was facing revolution at every turn, that he was unable, in effect, to impose unity on his people. Now, what was the solution? Well, the solution for him was to go to war. We know this. This is, in effect, explained by Shakespeare and Henry IV. in Henry V, even in Romeo and Juliet. Oh my God, in Julius Caesar. This is this effect of recreating unity against a common enemy. When your society is at risk, opposed eyes which like the meteors of a troubled heaven. This is from Henry IV. When your society is at risk, one of the most efficient ways of re-establishing the unity of your society is to engage in war. The French, I'm going to read you something. I hope I have it. I hope I don't take too much time to find it. And it's in French. So let me find it. All right. It's finding me every. Okay. All right. I'm not gonna find it here. Okay. So, what does the what does a minister say to Charleston? And he says it very explicitly. I mean, he completely understood this. Charleston has just emerged from a period of parliamentary crisis. And he was going towards new elections. He was forced to disband the parliament and he was going towards new elections. Well, what did this minister say? He says to the king, okay, le peuple français est oisif. The French people is flighty, is, and the only way of focusing their attention and recreating their unity is to go to war. Well, to go to war against who? Against the Moroccans. Against, in the region, rather, in the region of the Maghreb. So, what does he say? What does this mean? What it means is that, in effect, in order to recreate our unity, we need warfare. Okay, so they go to war and, in effect, establish. They were victorious, and they establish the colonialism that would last, I think, something like 100 and, well, if we calculate, about 140 years. Okay. So we know this is an act. This is something that states do. Well, art does that too. And if you look at this painting, what we are going to be arguing is that this painting does the same thing. Delacroix was in a period of crisis, and that crisis was in the art world, which in effect reflected the crisis that we find in the political world. There was two conceptions of economy. And when we say conceptions of economy, we also mean conceptions of society. There was one conception, and they were, in fact, they uneasily coexisted with each other. The first conception was the older conception. It was, in effect, the aristocratic conception. An aristocrat has a huge some domain. It could be very small, it could be very huge. In Scotland, for instance, if you buy a foot of land, you can be declared a lord. So you can. It costs you $40 now. Anyway, so if you have a piece of land, you are declared a lord. It has to be. The case of Scotland is weird, so it has to be something different. It can be huge, it can be small, but basically your wealth is largely, not only, but very largely based on agriculture. There are other resources such as tolls for passage, such as salt, such as minerals, but basically it's the land that gives you your wealth. On the other hand, you have a much more dynamic, much more innovative economy, which is the economy that was being built by the bourgeoisie. The same economy that in 1762, I think, started based on the first steam engine. Not the first really, but the first really functional one, the useful one. Which led to advances in mining, which led to increased extractions of energy, which in effect are going to lead to the explosion of change that we call the Industrial Revolution. These were the people who were preparing this Industrial Revolution. Innovative, intelligent, knowledgeable of mathematics, because they have to be. You can't be a merchant without real knowledge of mathematics. In contact, in trans-European contact with each other. The French were in constant contact with the British. The British were in constant contact with the French, with the Germans. They were constantly watching the innovations of each other. Because they were competing against each other. You don't get very far if you don't watch what your competitor is doing. So very innovative, very for the period producing very rapid changes, very intelligent, and very resistant to authoritarianism, very resistant to the old style of economy. These were the two that were against each other. Well, in the art world, this also manifested. How did it manifest? Well, you had the academy. The academy was established, was reinforced, in fact, and given its most authoritarian shape by Louis XIV. It was established before his reign. And the academy, the function of the academy was to unify the art world under the authority of the king. And basically its shape is, let's call it arborescent. It's a hierarchical shape. Where you have the academics, the academicians, let's call them. Their function is to teach art as it should be taught, meaning transfer the established form of art. And What do we mean by established form of art? Well, there was competition between classicism and Baroque, but essentially the greater theoretical framework was given by the classicists. And essentially their function is it's based on again a hierarchy of genres, a hierarchy of kinds of painting, with the highest kind of painting being history painting and religious painting. And the function of this painting is to install morality upon society. Is to give society its moral framework. And when we say morality, we mean, of course, religious morality, but also things afferent to the religious, related to the religious, things such as obedience to the king. Why? Well, based on the ideas of St. Augustine, among others, obedience to the king is obedience to God, because it is God who established the king. So you see these historical paintings whose function is, in effect, the establishment of this morality. Below that, you have what's called genre painting. A genre called genre. That's a little confusing, but I mean, it's nothing. Which is paintings of things occur. Sorry, above that you have portraits, of course. Portraits of the kings. Portraits was considered to be a very, very high art form. Below it, genre paintings. Below that, you have genre paintings is representations of the contemporary life. Below that, you could have landscapes. You can have still lifes, etc. Okay, so there is no etc. I mean, that's basically it, more or less. So the order of subject was also viewed hierarchically. How you entered into the academy was by presenting what's called a chef-d'oeuvre, a masterpiece. Basically, when you have graduated and achieved a certain reputation, you can apply to become a member of the academy by presenting a chef-d'oeuvre, a masterpiece, which could get you accepted or refused. You either got accepted as a history painter, as a portrait painter, as a genre painter, as a still life painter. You could get accepted, but the way you got accepted defined your position within the hierarchy of the academy. And what do the academics do? Well, among other things, they decide what is to be taught. And that's an enormous power. So their function is to maintain the stability of the artwork, of the art world. The stability in subject, the stability in technique, and more importantly, the most importantly, the stability in loyalty to the king, in service to the king. They decided what gets shown. Through the salon, and I'll explain what the salon is, they decided what artworks were to be shown in a manner that gave them, what artist is to be shown in a manner that gave him legitimacy. So what do we mean by the salon? For instance, what is the salon? It's the Salon Carré, the square salon. It's is enormous exhibition that occurred in the Louvre, where the academicians, les académiciens, decided which artworks are going to be shown in what was essentially the biggest artistic event in Europe. That's how big it was. They could get something like 1 million visitors a year. Remember, this is a population. We're not talking about current population. I want you to multiply 1 million by 7 amount. So consider that something that gets something like 7 million visitors a year. If we apply it to the number of people in during that period. So what does this mean? What it means is that they are the gatekeepers. They decide what gets shown. They decide what does not get shown. And the battle over what gets shown and what does not get shown is absolutely ferocious. And then you have the other models. What is the other model? Well, it's the free market model that was emerging then. What was happening is that the academies and the different teaching institutions were producing more artists than could be absorbed by the state. The state, the French state, was able to support a certain number of artists by buying artworks, by buying their artworks. An enormous number of masterpieces in the Louvre, for instance, were artworks that were bought by the French government from the artists themselves who had exhibited in the salon. And these, but this was a very limited ability. You know, the state cannot buy everything. And during these periods, there was tens of thousands of artworks that were being produced. Okay, what do we do with all these? The artists were asking themselves, okay, how do we survive? Of course, they were all trying to get into the academy. Not all, but you know, a fair share number of them. Of course, they were trying to get into the salon, to get shown in what was essentially the biggest event in Europe at the period. But their conception of the salon, their conception of their career, also had a different interpretation, in that they viewed the salon as essentially a part of their, I would say, commercial career. The salon was one place among many where they could have their work shown. The most important place, but yeah, but one place among many. We start seeing the emergence, okay, in embryonic form of what will become eventually the gallery scene. We didn't have galleries yet. What we had was marchands de tableau, merchants of paintings, which is different from a gallerist. But okay, all the antiviruses have turned on in your computers. Okay, what we have is these merchants, which were introducing these artists, which were through these art merchants starting to emerge. The artists being introduced to the bourgeoisie, the artist being sold, the work of the artist being sold to the bourgeoisie. But again, in order to gain some form of legitimacy, the best route was to get accepted in the salon. But your main client is not the state anymore. It's not the church anymore. It's not the aristocracy anymore. Your main client is now different. It's the bourgeoisie. With their ideas I told you about. Their ideas of commerce. Their ideas of the state, which are different from the aristocratic ideals of the 16th, 17th, 18th, up till the 19th century. So what do we have then? Well, you get somebody like Eugène Delacroix. I'm going to show you this painting. By the way, you can let me show you this one first. I hope I have it. Voilà, Le Radeau de la Méduse. If you look at this painting by Théodore Géricault, painting of exhibited, yeah, Madonna?
We can't see the painting.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. We're not sharing these. Oh, sorry about that. What were we sharing, by the way?
Le Radeau.
بالك كانت باينة.
Are you seeing it now?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay. So this is the raft of the Medusa, Le Radeau de la Méduse. And this painting, in effect, expresses all of the contradictions of the period. It's a painting that is based on a scandal. And the scandal is that a few years, and I think it's, if I'm not mistaken, 1817, but you can check it. The boat called La Méduse, the Medusa. This boat started to sink. The captain and his crew jumped on the lifeboats, took all the food with them, took all the water with them, and escaped, leaving something like, if I'm not mistaken, 190 people on board to fend for themselves. These people, what they did, you know, in an absolutely catastrophic manner, what they did was take planks, tie them together into a kind of boat. And on this boat, they had no water, they had no drinking, they had no, you know, and they started to die, and they couldn't all fit on the boat. So basically, you would have somebody on the boat while other people are hanging on the sides of the boat. And these were the first people who would die from exhaustion. You know, they would let go and they would sink. And they started to drop one by one. There was apparently cases of cannibalism. I'm sorry to say, there was rumors of cannibalism. Basically, an absolutely desperate situation. And what the moment that you see here is the moment when, at their very, 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 you know, just a point, just to give you, to give for Théodore Géricault, to give a suspense that they might have all died, actually. This is when they spot a boat and they start to call for the boat. This man is using his shirt in order to, as a flag, in order to indicate, to tell the boat over there that you see just as a point Tell you how far it is in their despair and they were saved actually. So out of the 190, if I'm not mistaken, again I'm using my memory, I think it's something about 9 people were saved. Why is this a scandal? Well, it's a scandal of a political nature, in that the captain of the Medusa was placed there by something today in Lebanon, we know what it is perfectly, Wasta. He was placed there because of his political connections, not because of his competence. And the liberal press are gonna latch on to this story in order to savage the royalty. So there was this ferocious discussion in 1818, 1819 about the Medusa and how the king is in fact placing all of those, only those who are closest to him, without regard to competence, in the most important positions of power. This was the debate, and it was a ferocious debate. Well, what did Theodore Géricault do? He created this, I won't call it realistic, so has a lot of elements of idealism in it, but let's indulge ourselves. But he created this image of a very shocking event. And this shocking event, which includes something as forbidden as cannibalism, he exhibited it in the salon. Well, what did this create? Those who were with the royalty attacked the painting ferociously. Those who were against the royalty, I'm simplifying, but to give for pedagogical reason, or those who were against the royalty defended the painting ferociously. And the painting wound up winning a golden medal in the salon. What does this tell us? What it tells us is that the Academy, first, what it tells us is that the Academy, which was supposedly aristocratic and supposedly controlled by the king, was able to take, was infiltrated by the liberals to a degree, where they were able to declare this painting as a winner. So what does this tell us? Of a ferocious battle for the Academy between the liberals and the royalists. Does this sound familiar to you, all al-Ma'arik, these battles for positions?
We are living these situations.
We're living it. I know, we're living it. It tells us something else. It introduced, I think it's the first in history, if I'm not mistaken. I might be mistaken, but I don't think so. It introduced something that we still see today. The French word is the succès à scandale. The success based on a scandal. What is that succès à scandale? When I tell you it's still used today, you know Benetton? Pierre, have you heard of them? No? Nobody's heard of Benetton? No?
No.
You haven't heard, Lodi, you haven't heard of Benetton yet?
No, yes.
Wow. Man, I feel old. Okay, anyway. All right. So Benetton was this company, Italian company. The United Colors of Benetton. No?
بلا
Thank God. Thank you.
بلا صح عارفة بس ما مزبوط لأنه
All right. So Benetton was this company that was $1 billion company, $1 billion. So they engaged in this publicity campaign in the 80s and the 90s. And the publicity campaign included images of warfare and horrible images of warfare. It included images of a man dying of AIDS. It included images of what was then completely scandalous sexuality. It included images of, for the people of the period. You remember that?
No, and I don't remember this.
Yeah, because you know the nice version of Benetton.
Yes, the nice version.
Yeah.
Not this
Well,
version.
Benetton, because of this publicity campaign, what it did was create enormous scandal. And that scandal meant that there was actually people, programs, okay? There's a program, a very intellectual program called Apostrophe in French. They discussed them for 45, 50 minutes.
Oof.
Okay. How much does it cost to get publicity for 45, 50 minutes on television?
A scandal.
They got it for free.
Oof.
Because everybody was talking about that.
Yes.
That's a good marketing strategy, by the way.
Of course, it's a good marketing strategy.
Oh my God.
This pseudo artist called Jeff Koons.
Yes.
He used it in the 80s, where he presented himself engaged in, let's call it, whatever you want to call it, with his then porn star wife. What's her name? Lucianta, something or the other. I have no idea what her name is. And it created a scandal which established this guy as a very important artist. Okay? Marcel Duchamp. What did he do?
Yes.
Well, Marcel Duchamp, the strategy of Marcel Duchamp is the direct descendant of the strategy of Géricault, Théodore Géricault. Because there was this scandal about his artwork, there were hundreds of articles for and against him. Hundreds of articles for and against them. What did it mean? It meant that people were fighting each other in order to see this painting. They had to play security. At one point, Théodore Géricault, when he won, he took the painting on tour. How rock artists go on tour? He took the painting on a tour where people would pay in order to go in and see the painting. What does that mean? Well, what it means is that, in effect, this is enormously, he stumbled upon it. I'm sure he didn't mean it. It's too unpredictable, especially when now it's predictable for us because we understand the mechanism. At that period, I don't think it was as predictable. I don't think Théodore Géricault would have been able to predict that this is what would have happened. But what did this scandal mean? What the scandal expressed was, in effect, the polarization, the division of French society, expressed in artworks. expressed in this very scandalous artwork. Well, if I ask you why this artwork is so scandalous, you might rightly say that it is scandalous because it's talking about something as horrible as, I don't know, as cannibalism, or at least connoting it, giving it, you know, linking the painting to it. So that when people looked at this painting, this is the link to the rumored acts of cannibalism certainly came to their minds. Their rage against the power, or their defense, again, enraged defense of power, also came to their mind. Okay. But such representations of absolutely scandalous subjects are nothing new. I mean, I want you to think of it while looking at this painting. This is a representation by Jean-Dominique Ingres. It's a painting by 1808, so about 11 years before this one. And this is a painting that represents something that should be scandalous on every level. First off, you have a naked male. Well, we're talking about a very conservative, compared to us, a very conservative society. So how would this society, haven't you ever thought of this? This is very strange. You take societies such as the Renaissance societies, societies, I don't know, of 1500s or the late 1400s. How is this society able to represent nudes in objects that are so public? And we're talking about their most naturalistic forms of representation. They didn't have photography yet. Because they didn't have photography, this was the highest level of naturalism that they possessed. They believed what they saw. Just like today, when you go into and you see a movie, you believe what you see for a while. You suspend disbelief that this is reality. Well, the more technology advances, the more our belief requires higher and higher level of naturalism. Now we're into the 3D. Eventually we'll go into the 3D, which will render the screen that you see before you here less realistic, less naturalistic. But for them, this was naturalism at its highest. And in this naturalistic style, in a public object, paintings were public objects that were represented for hundreds of thousands of people. In the case of the salon, they were able to represent a nude male. Not only a nude male, but also related to a completely scandalous story, which is the story of Eutychus. Absolutely scandalous. So, but this never caused a scandal, while this thing here caused a huge scandal. The question is why? Why did this not cause a scandal while this caused a huge scandal? It's very simple, really. Think of it this way. In American movies, now we see American movies, and we see things such as kissing all the time. Am I mistaken? Yeah?
No.
The hero kissing the heroine, etc. Okay. Now, I want you to imagine two Lebanese actors, an actor and an actress, kissing in the same way as the Americans. Would this cause a scandal, yes or no?
Yes.
Why?
No, Lebanese. No, we don't see it often.
What's the difference?
اجتماعيا ما كتير مقبولة
ايه
مثل
صح عنا ايه.
بس اجتماعيا, socially you're saying it's not very acceptable, but
Yeah.
It's acceptable enough that we look at it when we see American movies and we don't even bat an eye. It's even, we go bored again.
yeah.
Why? Isn't this strange? Well, the thing is that we have established a space, a ritualistic, narratively ritualistic space, I'll explain it, outside our own identity. Outside of our own Lebanese identity, there is this external place we call America, we call France, we call whatever you want, somewhere outside where these things occur, where these things are permissible in effect. But they don't affect us. They don't touch us. We see them as not touching us. This is why you say, Reem, it's not socially acceptable for this actor and actress to kiss each other. Because, well, why? Well, they're Lebanese. For them to kiss each other is absolutely scandalous. It is, in fact, introducing into our identity, into our sphere of identity, things that are acceptable outside but not acceptable within. This is why, in effect, we are completely shocked if we see a representation. I mean, I don't know. Look at this painting, okay? And imagine Eng, instead of this vague background that you see here, represented somewhere in Beirut. وحطوا لهذا الزلمة هيك ببيروت. Placed them in Beirut. What would it do? No?
Is it considered
Cause a
فيها
scandal?
مشكلة؟
Huh?
Is it though بعد هيك العقلية ببيروت as an art?
I suppose, I mean,
I'm not sure ما بعرف.
course,
I'm
there is
really asking.
variability in the population of Beirut. Of course. There are people who will completely accept it. There are people who will, there are people who will absolutely refuse it. But if we talk about those people who absolutely refuse it, if you show them this painting, they're going to say, yeah, okay. If you show them this painting with the background in Beirut, it's going to cause problems. So why? Well, the space of identity is the space of morality. I'm not saying ethics, morality. It is the space where, in effect, we have things that are simply not acceptable. But how do we represent eroticism, such as the odalisque, for instance? Let me show you the odalisque, this painting here. How do we represent her? What do we do? We want to, this is Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, masterpiece, Le Grand Obélisque. Again, it's very strange. This is a representation, a frankly erotic representation, whereas the above one was not erotic, I think. But anyway, this is a frankly erotic representation of a nude woman. Why did this not create a scandal? Well, Western societies produced ways of showing the prohibited, created ways of showing the prohibited. And what are these ways of showing the prohibited? It's through their exteriorization. It's by saying, this is from another time, Greeks. This is in another country, the Ottoman Empire. And the woman here that you see is supposedly from a woman from the Ottoman Empire. So this nude, this eroticism that we see here is not from our region. It does not affect our circle of morality. But it's them, it's these outsiders, the Greeks, which we admire, but they are still outsiders, and those Ottomans, which we fear, and they are, of course, outsiders. You don't allow it to enter into the sphere of identity. What did Jericho do here? In this painting. Well, what he did was show an act of transgression within his own society. And what did this do? Of course, what it did was cause enormous controversy, leading almost accidentally to enormous success. This is a strategy that is used again and again and again by artists today. But in effect, it represents Western society for a very simple reason. And if you don't have freedom of press, you cannot have controversy. Why? Well, for a very simple reason. In Stalinist Russia, you don't have controversy in Stalinist Russia, or in Mao's China, or in Pol Pot's, if you say something controversial, what happens to you? If you say something that could be opposed to the state, whereas in society with the beginnings of quite considerable for that period freedom of speech, we see the possibilities of these controversies. We see these controversies occurring. And we see the attempt at their manipulation. And among the first who's going to almost, and this is a hypothesis because I don't read the man's mind, I don't read his mind. The first who's going to try to consciously manipulate controversy is a gentleman by the name of Eugène Delacroix. We're gonna take a 10-minute break, and then we're gonna see the death of Sardanapalus. All right?
Okay.
Don't leave, just, turn off your, you're already all turned off and muted. Okay, I'm gonna turn myself off. We see each other at 7:54. So no Intel, no, please, I don't see anything in Teams. I was disconnected. The Wi-Fi, من الwind. Oh boy. Well, good thing we have recordings because it's the usual catastrophe. All right,
Yes.
everybody here? Let me do
I think.
something, which is
Yes, Doc.
meeting notes, meeting details, attendance list. Okay. No attendance list. All right. So this is the painting we will be discussing, but before that, I want to show you another painting. This is, in a sense, Delacroix's attempt. Let's not be cynical about it, right? But I mean, and move beyond the psychological. But we can consider it a gambit, an attempt to get the same effect as the Raft of the Medusa by Géricault. How? This is a painting by Eugène Delacroix. It's called The Massacre of Chios, or the Massacre de Chios. It's from 1824. 2 years earlier, well, let's start it that way. Eugène Delacroix had great admiration for Lord Byron, the poet, the Romantic poet. And Lord Byron was fully in support and fought himself for Greek independence against the Ottoman Empire. And during that war of independence in 1822, the Ottomans, they wanted to give a lesson to the Greek people. So they entered into the island of Chios. And in the island of Chios, they killed about 20,000 people, enslaved and numerous others, unknown numbers. And this was an event that caused enormous outrage in Europe. Well, enormous outrage in Europe, but for the monarchists, this was an ambiguous event. The War of Independence. In that, they viewed the Greek War of Independence as having revolutionary connotations, as basically a people entering into warfare against their own king. So that the support for the Greek independence was kind of muted. On the other hand, the liberals were for Achille, of course, the Greeks. What is going to create this synthesis is the ability of the royalists to represent, reframe this battle as a battle against the supposed destroyers of Greek civilizations. And give it also, of course, its religious connotations, Christianity versus Islam. So in 1824, when Jean Delacroix presented this artwork, it did not create a scandal. Why? Well, neither the liberals nor really the monarchists were against, were now against the, it was too ambiguous. Delacroix might have expected some controversy, and the only controversy he got was regarding the background. The artwork was considered to be unfinished. The artwork was considered to be almost esquisse, sketch. And he got a medal, but it was not something of of great distinction. So the problem was, okay, you see somebody like Eugène Delacroix. And Eugène Delacroix is, in effect, today we consider him as the leader of the Romantic school of painting. But during that period, he was not. During that period, he was in fierce competition with others. And the worst thing in that competition, as Eugène Delacroix probably understood, is not to be attacked. The worst thing is not to be noticed. To be attacked in some form of controversy of those coming against you, those coming with you. He understood it. He started to understand it as something that could, in effect, be beneficial to his career. So, what do? Well, we have to create a scandal. Put yourself in this state of mind. Okay. But this scandal, it's very important that not everybody is against it. This scandal is very important that there are those against it, there are those against the painting, there are those with the painting. So a painting that creates a scandal is one that is, in fact, that creates controversy. It's not necessarily one, it's not at all one that everybody accepts, nor one that everybody is against. Okay, so you have to create this delicate balance of those with and those against. And this is the painting he attempted to use to do that. It's scandalous in the sense that what we see here is obviously, I'll tell you the story. It's a story of suicide, it's a story of lust, it's a story of murder. This is the king, Sardanapalus, Ashurbanipal, his real name, who was besieged in his city of Nineveh by the Medes, according to Herodotus, by the way. It's not a true story. Who was besieged in Nineveh, and he decides to burn everything that he has, all of his possessions. And I use the word possessions carefully because he considered the women here to be his possessions, the horses to be his possessions, the gold, to place them all on a single pile, murder everyone, and burn himself alive. This is the story, of course, that started with Herodotus. It's taken again by, I'm trying to remember his name, another Greek historian, and it's retaken by Lord Byron, who turns it into a play. So, in effect, a representation of an act of violent suicide, and Jean Delacroix increases the violence by representing these nude women that are in fact being butchered, that are in effect being victimized in a way that could be described as a form of sexual victimization. I want you to look at this one and how she is placed. Think of it. Now, I want you to replace these women in your mind with Parisian women. Imagine Eugène Delacroix represented Parisian women in that way. How would his painting have been received? All right, I'll ask it another way. Go ahead, Harvard.
I think it was refused by the من المجتمع. I think that لأنه
yeah, it was refused. But I want you to think what would have happened before we go on based on, you know, fragments that we know. What would have happened?
Yes.
If he had represented contemporary Parisian women in that situation? Okay, I'll ask you another way.
Okay.
What would have happened if a Lebanese artist represented Lebanese women in that way?
It would be a scandal نوعا ما يعني ما كانوا قبلوا.
It will يعني بدهم يهاجموا الرسام، بيهاجموا الرسام، بيعارضوا الرسم.
And this is a painting in 1827. But if this painting, so we always assume that in 1827 they were more conservative than they were, more conservative than we were. But this painting by a society more conservative than we are, if we apply it to our own society in 2020, we're talking about, you know, it will still create a scandal. Why? It's the same thing. Why, if we see two Lebanese actors kissing, it creates a scandal. Whereas if we see American or French actors kissing, we don't even, you know, we forget it 3 minutes later, 2 seconds later. مظبوط?
Yep.
So what was going on here? Well, Eugène Delacroix expected this painting to be accepted. Yes, it was scandalous, you know, cheap, scandalous in the sense of, you know, a little sexual titillation, a little, you know, violence, a little, but he didn't expect the reaction that he got. I'll explain to you what that reaction was. Well, he accepted, what he expected is that everybody would accept this. Why? Because these weren't Parisian women that were being represented in that way. These were women in that Orient, in that external space. Just like the odalisque above that we saw was in an external space, outside of the space of identity, of the circle of identity. She was in that Ottoman Empire, just like the Greek Oedipus was in that Greek space. All of these spaces were external spaces where prohibited elements could be shown. And in that sense, this is what we can describe as ritualistic spaces. What do we mean by ritual in that sense? Well, if you take the Dionysiac rituals, for instance, in Greece, or the Saturnalia in Rome. These, or the Carnival in Rio de Janeiro. These were ritualistic events where people engaged in activities that would be considered to be prohibited. Well, these events were framed. They were framed, first off, they were framed by their sacred nature. The bacchanalias were sacred events. They were framed by time and they were framed by space. They occur here within that time period. And here within that time period, we are engaging in activities that are completely unacceptable outside of that time period. Art plays that same role. The arts that we are seeing here is playing that same role. We are framing it, these prohibited events, the prohibited eroticism that we see. We are framing it by saying that this is something that occurs outside of our society. We are external onlookers. We're not participating as Frenchmen and French women. We're not participating in this event. But who is this painting organized in relation to? Is it organized in relation to Iraqis? Is it organized in relation to, I don't know, the Lebanese? Who did Delacroix assume as his public? Did he know the existence of him? His public, his assumed public, of course, was the French, who could, in effect, observe and get titillated, or supposedly get titillated by this thing that we are seeing here, this act of murder, this act of sexual murder, this act of suicide in the most violent way imaginable. I don't want to exaggerate, but the word comes to my mind of snuff movie. But I might be exaggerating a bit. So, what does this do? What is it supposed to do? Well, what you are seeing here is an event with a resolution. And that event with a resolution, a representation, a narrative with a resolution. By the way, narrative is a way also of limiting the ritual. It has a beginning, it has an end. After that, the ritual has ended. So, what we are seeing here is the death of somebody who has done bad things. You can read Herodotus about that. And who is going to die for it? Those looking at his death, who are they? Well, the French public. And just like in a theater piece, when you see somebody die, what you have is, you're supposed to have, is a unified reaction to this event. That unified reaction of the death of the stranger who did bad things is, in effect, structurally similar to the unified reaction that minister in France, the minister of Charles X in France, was expecting the French to have against the people of the Maghreb, of the Arabic Maghreb. Meaning a unity against the bad person or the bad people or whatever who are going to die. If we want to relate that to René Girard, we can say that this is in fact a form of human sacrifice. War, when it's done for those reasons, is a form of human sacrifice. You are sacrificing somebody external to your social order in order to re-establish its unity. The Greeks did it with the pharmakos. They had actually human sacrifice. The Aztecs did it. We see, in fact, connotations of this in enormous number of civilizations. So, what was the behavior that Delacroix was expecting? It was the behavior of unity against the stranger who is going to die. Re-establishing the unity of the people. Well, what happened? It didn't work. Why? Well, there are various explanations for it. I'm going to give my hypothesis. It might be wrong, it might be right. I think it's right. Otherwise, I wouldn't have given it, but I might be completely deluding myself. But I think that the Orient as a narrative space, as a ritualistic space of exteriority, an exterior ritualistic space was not yet established. The Orient was not yet, there were Orientalism before that. In the period of the crisis where the Ottomans were very, very dangerously entering their forays up to Vienna in Europe, you had representations of the soldiers holding Christ as brown people, as brown as me, holding Christ for him to be taken and captured and crucified. So there was these forms of Orientalism. But it wasn't as established yet as it would have been, it would become in the 19th century. And this is why, in effect, the painting was refused. Why there was this reaction against it. The people looking at these women getting murdered still saw them as human beings. They had not yet dehumanized them. As we will see, we will eventually see the dehumanization of Arabs, of Muslims in paintings, and eventually, of course, in cinema and in television. Up till very recently, by the way. What happened? They were looking at these women, and essentially what they were seeing was, in effect, they're still human. They still could be, up to a point, Parisians, getting butchered in that way. So you had this levée de bouclier, you had this completely opposite reaction. Everybody, in fact, most everybody, except for people who were friends with Delacroix, who attempted to defend him. But Delacroix was made to understood that if you want to continue your career, dear friend, cher ami, il faut calmer. You have to, you know. But eventually, of course, the Orient will be established as a space of representation where you had representation of the Arabs and the Muslims as barbarians, as violent, as despotic, and more recently in the 70s, 80s, 60s, 70s, 80s as terrorists, as, you know, the stereotypical image, which in fact goes beyond the single discipline up to every discipline, every artistic discipline that we see. That was the first problem. Was the second problem is a formal problem. In that neoclassicism imposed forms of pictoriality, meaning la touche lisse, the emphasis on line as opposed to color, the emphasis on form, the purity of lines. All of these were, in fact, means of separating the artwork from proximate reality, from reality within identity. So that you don't see, they were made to understand, or they made to justify to themselves and to others, but you have to lie to yourself, lie effectively to others, that this, in fact, lines, the emphasis on lines of a Jean-Dominique Ingres, the emphasis on line here transformed this representation of a nude woman from something, let's call it erotic, to something idealistic, almost in a Platonic sense. So that you can, guilt-free, enjoy the eroticism of this woman. Well, the problem was the technique of and this is related to its origins in Baroque and its origins more importantly in Rococo. The emphasis on color of somebody like Eugène Delacroix was seen by Ingres as being highly immoral. La ligne, c'est la moralité, monsieur. The line is morality. This is something that Ingres shouted at Eugène Delacroix. He went crazy against him. That he was accusing him that because he was placing so much emphasis on color, color is related to the body, related to sensuality, that he was being almost a pornographer. Whereas he viewed his own representation of the nude as being protected from immorality, as excluding the nude from the circle of identity by placing it in an almost Platonic ideal world. And this is also, in a sense, political. We've seen in our society the politicization of color. The opposition between line and the emphasis on line and the emphasis on color had also had political connotations. Romantics, and this is going to change, and I'll explain to you the importance of these changing, that there was a period where neoclassicism was associated with the revolution, and then it turned. Neoclassicism became associated with the restoration. And so the opposition between emphasizing color or emphasizing line denoted for the artists involved their political positions. And this could change. It tells you, there's nothing inherent in color or line that says that this is liberal or this is conservative. There's nothing. It's just, it's an arbitrary choice. I choose X because the other guy who I hate chose Y. I can't choose Y. I have to choose X. So what do we see then? What we see then is how, in fact, these elements are linked together. And what we see is, in fact, two failures, two ritualistic failures. The first ritualistic failure is Charles X's war. What happened? Well, the Orleanists, there was a revolution in 1830, and Charles X was deposed. The second, his attempt to create unity behind him, using violence against others, did not work. The second failure is, of course, the failure of Eugène Delacroix, who was attempting to create unity against these poor women, against this man, Ashur Banipal, who actually existed, but he's nothing like Herodotus describes him, and create a unity of the French people against these degenerate external Orientals. It did not work, but then. It did not work then. But eventually, the Orient will be established as a place where Europe could export its violence, both through colonialism, through actual wars, and through artistic representations. In a let's call it style, a subject rather, called Orientalism, leading, of course, to Walt Disney's representation of Arabs in Alibaba, where if they don't like your face, they cut off your ear. Now, that kind of racist representations of Arabs. Any questions? All right. Thank you very much. And
أنا عندي بس سؤال بخصوص بكرة، بس إذا فيني أسألك من بكرة. عنا الأساينمنت ما هيك لبكرة تبع الميثودولوجي. أوكي، بينون هو آخر ديلاي ما هيك؟
ديلاي اللي حطوا على
عندي سؤال بس، لأنه أنا وقت عم بحطه على هذا تيمز الأساينمنت عم بحسه عم بيروح.
Let's stop the recording because this has nothing to do with this is rather another course. Okay, so we are stopping the recording.